I woke up to the sound of soft humming. It wasn't a radio. It wasn't the housemaid. It was coming from the garden. I stepped out of my guest room, rubbed my eyes, and followed the sound. There, under the almond tree, was Madame Veronica. She was watering her flowers, a watering can in one hand, a scarf tied around her hair, and she was humming a song I hadn't heard before. The sun was rising behind her. The sky was orange. And for the first time, I forgot she was old. She didn't look like a madam or a boss or the powerful woman people feared. She looked peaceful, gentle, human. And then something happened. She turned and saw me. And she smiled. Not the polite kind. Not the business kind. It was a full, soft smile that reached her eyes. And for the first time I smiled back without fear. That day was different. Not because she said something magical. Not because she gave me money. But because the walls between us were finally beginning to crumble. Just a little. At breakfast, she poured tea for me again without asking. Then she said, "I'm thinking of opening a mini supermarket in town. Would you like to handle it?" I was shocked. Me? Yes. You'll be supervised, but the plan, the location, the design, it's yours. I blinked. I've never run a shop before. That's why I said you'll be supervised, she replied calmly. I nodded slowly. Thank you. She sipped her tea. You've earned it. After breakfast, we sat in the study reviewing the property list for the shop. For the first time she allowed me to lead. She listened. She didn't interrupt. And when I got stuck on something, she leaned forward and said, "Think. Don't rush." Her voice wasn't cold. It was guiding. Later that evening, she called me to sit with her in the living room. We were both quiet at first. Then she asked, "What did you dream about as a boy?" I laughed softly. I wanted to be a teacher. Why? Because my primary school teacher used to clap for me any time I got an answer right, I said. He made me feel seen. She smiled. And now? I still want to teach, I said. Maybe not in a classroom, but maybe through the things I build. She nodded. Good. We sat in silence again. Then I asked her something that had been in my heart for a while. Why do you love flowers so much? She looked at the vase beside her and said, Because they bloom quietly. I frowned. Quietly? Yes. They don't make noise. They don't fight for attention. They grow in silence. But when they bloom, everyone notices. She turned to me. Be like that, Daimeji. Bloom quietly. Her words sank deep into my chest. And I knew I'd never forget them. The next morning, we visited the land where the supermarket would be built. It was a small piece of land close to the junction, busy enough for sales but quiet enough for calm. She stood beside me and said, This will be your test. Can you grow something from the ground up? Can you bloom quietly? I nodded, my heart beating fast. I'll try. She patted my shoulder. I believe you. Over the next week, I began planning the shop. She gave me a budget. She connected me to builders, suppliers, and sign makers. I named it the Almond Market, after the tree where I first saw her smile. She didn't comment on the name. But later that night I heard her telling the housemaid, It's a beautiful name. One evening, while looking at the shop sketches, she said, Would you like to see pictures of my younger days? I nodded eagerly. She brought out a small leather photo album from the bookshelf. Inside were photos of her in her 20s and 30s. She was stunning. Slim waist, wide smile, bold eyes. She pointed at one picture. That was in 1988. I had just opened my third boutique. I laughed. You were a slayer. She rolled her eyes. That's what they called me. We both laughed. And in that moment I didn't see age. I saw courage. A woman who had lived, lost, and survived. That night I wrote in my journal. Today she smiled. And I forgot her age. For the first time I saw her, not as a rich woman or my boss, but as someone with a past, a heart, and a deep well of silence. Days passed. And the shop began to take shape. The signboard was placed. The shelves were fixed. Paint was chosen, soft green and white. And each evening I would report back to her. She would nod, ask questions, make suggestions. Then one evening, as I was about to leave her office, she called me back. Daimeji. Turned. Yes, Ma. She smiled again. You've come a long way. Smiled too. So have you. I was cleaning the study when I found it. It was a Sunday afternoon. The sun outside was hot enough to boil water, and the housemaid had gone to visit her family. Madame Veronica was taking her usual nap, and I decided to organize some of the dusty old shelves in the study. They hadn't been touched in years. She had told me, that shelf is full of useless things. But I knew better. In rich people's homes, nothing is ever truly useless. It's either forgotten or painful. And as I dusted, something fell to the ground. An envelope. Brown. And sealed. And on the front, written in shaky handwriting. Michael. My son. Froze. The name again. Michael. The boy who left. The ghost that haunted her. My heart beat faster as I picked it up gently, like it was made of glass. I didn't plan to read it. But something pulled me. Maybe curiosity. Maybe a strange kind of love. Or maybe the silent pain I saw in her eyes that night she cried. So I sat down. And I opened it. Dear Michael, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know where you are or if you're safe. But I'm writing this because my heart is tired of holding in the words. I didn't raise you perfectly. I made mistakes. I was harsh. I gave more correction than comfort. I tried to teach you how to be strong, but maybe I forgot to show you how to be soft too. The day you left, I was angry. But underneath the anger was fear. Then grief. Then shame. I told everyone you stole from me. But I never told anyone that you took my heart with you. You were not just my adopted son. You were my child. My baby. My reason to fight. Now the house is quiet. My days are long. My money feels empty. My nights are filled with what ifs. If you're out there, forgive me. Not because I'm weak, but because I'm finally ready to say I was wrong about how I showed love. Come back. Or don't. But know this. You were always enough. Mama. I didn't know when the tears came. They just rolled down my cheeks. The words felt like they weren't meant for him alone. They were also for me. For all the broken boys who never heard. You were always enough. I folded the letter carefully and put it back into the envelope. Then I placed it exactly where I found it. Not because I wanted to hide it again, but because I knew she wasn't ready to let it go. That evening I acted normal. We ate quietly. She asked about the shop. I told her the painters had finished. She nodded. She didn't notice my red eyes. Or maybe she did and said nothing. That was her way. But something inside me changed that day. I saw her differently. Not just as a woman who had suffered loss, but as a mother whose love had turned into fear. Fear of being hurt again. Fear of being left. Fear of not being enough. The next day, I knocked on her door before work. She opened it surprised. You're early, she said. I wanted to ask you something. She stepped aside. Come in. I sat on the edge of her couch. She watched me carefully. Cleared my throat. Have you ever written a letter you never sent? Her eyes darkened. She sat beside me. Yes. Why didn't you send it? She looked down at her hands. Because I was afraid he would never reply. I nodded slowly. Do you still want him to reply? Silence. Then, I don't know. She stood. Walked to the window. Spoke quietly. Some letters are written for others. Some are written for ourselves. Which one was yours? He turned. Then asked. Why are you asking? I hesitated. Then said. Because sometimes we heal by saying what we couldn't say before. She walked over to me and sat down again. Then whispered. I don't think I'm ready to heal. That night I stood by her door again. Letter in my hand. I had taken it. Not to steal it. But to give it back differently. I had copied the words onto clean paper. Placed it in a new envelope. And added 4 more words at the end. I miss you still. I slid it under her door. Then I went to bed. The next morning she didn't mention it. We worked as usual. Reviewed accounts. Talked about new suppliers. Ate lunch in silence. Then, just as I was leaving the study, she called my name. Daimeji. Turned. She didn't look at me. Just said, "Thank you." Then went back to writing. That evening, she didn't sit in her usual chair. I found her in the garden, holding the new envelope, reading it slowly. Her lips moved, as though whispering the words. When she saw me, she didn't speak. She just held the letter to her chest. And I knew. A wound had opened. But so had a door. The next day, something new appeared in the living room. Photo frame. Not of her shops. Not of land. But of her and Michael. Smiling. Happy. Alive. She didn't say a word about it. Neither did I. But the house felt lighter. Like someone had opened a window. And let the pain breathe. The first time I walked into a boardroom with Madame Veronica, I felt like a leaf caught in a storm. The air was cold, the table long, and the people seated around it looked like they chewed confidence for breakfast. Men in tailored suits. Women in glasses with voices like blades. Each one held a file, a plan, or a sharp opinion. And me. I had none of that. Just my name. And the weight of all the judgments I thought I had left behind. But then she walked in. Madame Veronica. Wearing a blue lace booba and a gold necklace that sparkled every time she turned. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't shout. But the moment she stepped into the room listened. Like water stilling for a rock. She sat at the head of the table. And pointed at the empty seat beside her. "Sit, Daimeji." I obeyed. But inside I was shaking. The meeting began. Discussions flew across the table. Numbers. Deadlines. Delivery issues. Loss projections. Nobody looked at me. Until she said, "Daimeji, what do you think?" Silence. Heads turned. All eyes on me. My tongue felt like sandpaper. She didn't interrupt. She didn't save me. She just waited. And somehow that gave me strength. Took a breath. And spoke. Slowly. Carefully. But clearly. I explained a simple marketing idea I'd been working on for the almond market. A plan to add home delivery and create loyalty cards for frequent buyers. One of the women in glasses raised an eyebrow. "That's actually clever," she said. The man next to her nodded. "Could work in smaller communities." I blinked. They weren't mocking me. They were listening. When the meeting ended, Madame Veronica leaned over and whispered, "You did well." And just like that, I grew 2 inches taller inside. That was the first time she made me feel like I wasn't just a boy she rescued, but a man she respected. That evening I sat with her in the garden. She was wearing her old white scarf, the one she only wore when she was in a reflective mood. She asked, "How did you feel today?" "Nervous," I said. "But you spoke." "I had to." "Why?" I looked at her. "Because you believed in me first." She smiled. Then said, "Let me teach you something." She stood and motioned for me to follow. We walked into the house. She took me to her room, a place I rarely entered. From the wardrobe, she brought out an old wooden box. Inside were papers, notes, and certificates. "Everything I've ever owned that mattered," she said. She pulled out a dusty notebook. On the cover was her name. Inside, handwritten in red ink, was a list. "Things I must become before I die." She read aloud. 1. A woman no man can silence. 2. A leader who listens. 3. A mother with or without children. 4. A giver without regret. 5. A teacher to someone who wants to rise. She closed the book and placed it in my hands. "I wrote this when I was 20. I held the book like it was sacred." "You've become all those things," I said. She turned to the mirror. "Not yet. I'm still working on the last one." "The teacher." She nodded. "But you've been teaching me," I whispered. She smiled at me through the mirror. "Yes. And now it's your turn." The next day she called all her staff, drivers, cleaners, cooks, guards, into the small hall at the back of the house. She stood at the front. "This is Daimeji," she said. "He is my husband. He is also my business partner. From today he will begin training each of you in small groups. Not just about business, but about courage." Everyone clapped. I stood frozen. She leaned closer. "Teach them what I taught you." I began the next week. Every evening I stood in front of 5 or 6 staff members and talked. I was scared at first, but slowly it became natural. I taught them budgeting. I taught them how to write CVs. I taught them how to read contracts. And then, I began teaching them how to believe in themselves. Saad called one night excited. "Brother Daimeji, our teacher gave me a star. She said I answered questions like someone whose brother is a businessman." I laughed till my stomach hurt. Tope got his first school certificate for neatness. Fola could now recite AZ without missing a letter. Their laughter on the phone became the music of my soul. One evening I came home from a meeting. I was tired, worn out. I dropped my bag and sat on the floor of my room. I didn't even take off my shoes. Madame Veronica knocked. I stood quickly. "No need," she said. She sat beside me on the floor. "I remember those days," she said. "When the world feels like too much." He nodded. "I want to be strong," I whispered. "But some days." "You are strong," she said. "You just don't feel it every day." I looked at her and asked, "What if I fail?" She replied, "Then fail forward. Learn. Get up. Wear a new shirt. And walk into the world again." That night, I didn't write in my journal. Instead, I sat at the edge of my bed and stared at the sky through the window. And said aloud, "Thank you for teaching me to hold my head high. Even when I'm scared. Even when I don't know what tomorrow will bring. Even when the world still whispers. Because now, I knew something no one could take from me. I am no longer the boy the world tried to break. I am the man this woman chose to build." Started with a look. That curious, hesitant look people give you when they're trying to figure out if the stories they heard about you are true. I was walking through the market to buy groundnut oil and some spices for Madame Veronica's cook. I passed 3 young men sitting by a kiosk. They looked up as I walked by. One of them said, "Is that not the woman's husband?" Another replied, "Nah him oh. But I heard say him now day manage big shop." The third added, "I saw him last week with those men from Abuja. He shook their hands like say he na their oga." I didn't stop walking. But I heard everything. And for the first time, they weren't laughing. At the almond market, business was booming. The small supermarket idea that started with a sketch in the garden had grown into something the whole town now talked about. We had hired 3 cashiers, a delivery boy, and a night guard. We introduced loyalty cards just like I planned, and customers started coming not just from our street but from other parts of town. And every time I visited the store, people greeted me differently. They stood when I entered. They smiled. They nodded in respect. And slowly, the town began to bow. Not with fear, not with shame, but with recognition. Even the ones who used to whisper. Fatai, my old friend who once mocked me for marrying a woman old enough to be my mother, met me one afternoon outside the shop. He had his cap in his hand. "Daimeji," he said. "You fit talk to madam for me? A day fine job. Anything way I fit do." I stared at him. He looked small. Not because of his size. But because shame is a heavy cloth that even big boys can't wear well. He nodded. "Come to the house on Monday. Bring your papers." He looked up surprised. "You go help me." "Why not?" He smiled, his shoulders dropping. "You day try Daimeji. You know even change." I smiled faintly. But inside I knew I had changed. Not in pride, but in purpose. One evening I walked with Madame Veronica through the neighborhood. We didn't tell anyone. We just left the mansion quietly, no guards, no driver. She wanted fresh air. I wanted to stretch my legs. As we strolled, people came out of their houses to greet us. Children waved. Elders nodded. Traders paused their selling. She walked tall, calm, regal. I walked beside her. No longer as the boy they mocked, but as the man they now respected. A woman selling bananas stood and said, "God bless you, madam. This your husband day help my son write application oh." Veronica smiled. "He's full of surprises." Another woman said, "Thank you for opening that shop. It helped this community well. And for the first time she looked proud. Not of herself, but of me. Back at the house, she said something I didn't expect. "You've changed this town faster than I ever did." I laughed. "Me? How?" "You brought something I never could," she replied. "Which is heart." I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled. Later that night I checked my phone and saw a message from my primary school teacher, Mr. Taiwo. I hadn't spoken to him in years. The message read, "Daimeji, I passed by your shop today. I was told you're the one behind it. I'm proud of you. You were always a quiet leader. Keep going." I stared at the message for a long time, then replied, "Thank you, sir. Your words helped build me." 'Cause they had. The next morning as I stepped into the mansion, one of the guards stood taller and said, "Good morning, Oga Daimeji." Not small boy. Not madam's boy. But Oga. I smiled and nodded. "Good morning." Saad called that afternoon. "Brother Daimeji," she said, "my school wants you to come and talk to us during career day. They said we should invite someone we look up to." My throat tightened. "Really?" "Yes," she said, excited. "I told them you're my hero." Closed my eyes. I didn't deserve that title, but I would earn it. Every day. That evening I told Veronica about it. She nodded. "You should go." "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "Say the truth," she replied. "Tell them you were once a boy who had nothing, but became a man who gave everything." As I walked away from her that night, I passed the big mirror in the hallway. Stopped. Looked at myself. My posture was different now. My eyes held less fear. My face had grown sharper, not in age but in awareness. And in that moment, I whispered to my reflection, "You are no longer hiding." Because the town that once mocked me now listened when I spoke. Because the girl I raised as a sister now called me her hero. Because the woman who once kept me at a distance now looked at me with pride. And most of all, because I was becoming the man I once dreamed of being. Slowly, silently, strongly. There's something strange about success. When you're poor, people treat you like dust on their slippers. But when you rise, even just a little, they look at you like gold they once threw away. They smile wider, speak softer. And sometimes, the same people who tried to destroy you now want to sit at your table. That's what began to happen. Madame Veronica's enemies slowly started knocking on my door. It began with Chief Bamadil. I had heard of him long before I met him. He was one of the richest men in the neighboring town and had tried to buy out Veronica's largest farmland 5 years ago. She refused. He spread rumors about her. Called her greedy, dangerous, said she was holding on to land she didn't deserve. But now things had changed. The almond market was expanding. A second branch had just opened 2 towns away. I was now managing both locations, overseeing stocks, staff, accounts, and logistics. Veronica was giving me more room to lead, and I was filling those shoes carefully. So when Chief Bamadil called and asked for a meeting, I was shocked. "Tell him I'm not available," I told the housemaid. But Veronica heard. She called me into the study. "Why did you turn him down?" she asked calmly. "He insulted you," I said. She raised an eyebrow. And I'm loyal to you." She smiled. "I know. But sometimes enemies become tools. Not because they change but because we change." I frowned. "You want me to meet with him?" "Yes," she said. "Meet him. Listen. Learn." I went. We met at his office. Polished floors, air conditioning, pictures of him shaking hands with governors and senators. He stood when I entered. "Ah, Daimeji," he said loudly. "The young lion himself." I didn't smile. I just nodded. "Good afternoon, sir." He offered me a drink. I declined. He started talking. Long words. Big compliments. Fake laughter. Then the real reason. I want to invest in your next branch, he said. And blinked. My next branch? Yes, I believe in your vision. You're a sharp boy. Smart. Clean. If we work together, we'll own this whole region. I looked at him. And I remembered how he called Veronica a wicked old woman. I remembered how he told people she was cursed. How he laughed when her shops almost went bankrupt. Understood. Thank you, sir, I said. But we're not looking for investors right now. He blinked. We? Yes, I said. My wife and I. Then I walked out. When I got back home, I told Veronica everything. She didn't speak. She just walked to the window and looked out. After a long silence, she said, "Thank you. Not for saying no, but for remembering to say we." After that, more came. Mrs. Okonkwo, the woman who once called me a boy toy, sent a message through her daughter. She wants to sponsor a shop extension, the girl said. No thanks, I replied. Mr. Adissa, who once mocked Veronica in front of the town council, sent an invitation to a charity event. I didn't reply, because it was never about pride. It was about honor. And I had learned that from her. But not every former enemy was fake. Some truly changed, like Mr. Say. He was a retired banker who had once tried to take over Veronica's warehouse project by bribing officials. One day I met him at a local conference. He came to me afterward and said, "I want to apologize." I looked at him unsure. He added, "I fought your wife because I thought she was too powerful. But now I see she was just too ahead." I nodded slowly, then said, "She's still ahead." He smiled. "I'd like to volunteer to teach financial literacy at your training center. Free of charge." I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He replied, "Because some fights are best settled with service." I shook his hand. And for the first time I believed an old enemy had truly become a friend. Back at the mansion I told Veronica. She nodded. "You'll have to decide who you forgive," she said. "And who you keep at a distance." "How do I know the difference?" She answered, "Time. Time will always tell." One evening I was invited to speak at the local business seminar. Me, Meiji, the same boy who once begged for leftover beans. I wore a clean shirt, combed my hair, and stood on the stage in front of over 100 people. I told them my story. About the death of my parents. About sleeping on the floor with my siblings. About the hunger. About the rumors. About the shame. And about the strange, sharp turn my life took when I walked through a tall iron gate and met a woman who changed everything. People clapped. Some stood. Others wiped their eyes. And when I stepped down, one elderly man in Agbada shook my hand and said, "You're not just her husband. You're a pillar now." That night, Veronica placed a file in front of me. "What's this?" I asked. She smiled. "The deed to our 5th property. It's in your name now." Froze. "My name?" "Yes. You've earned it." I stared at the document. Heavy. Official. Powerful. But my voice was small. "Why me?" She looked into my eyes. "Because you didn't just marry me to survive. You stayed to grow." I held the paper like it was fragile. But what I was really holding was something deeper. Trust. And I knew now. Even if her enemies bowed. Even if the town clapped. Even if the world offered titles and praise. Nothing would ever matter more than the day she said, "You've earned it."